Massachusetts and grew up on Cape Cod. Professor Powers' first career ambition was to play professional ice hockey, and he spent much of his youth working towards that goal. I took a few minutes of the Professor's time earlier just to talk about the fantastic sport that ice hockey is. At some stage he discovered that there was something even more satisfying than chasing someone around on an ice rink with a large curved stick. And so he went on to religious studies at McMaster University, where he focused on Sanskrit Buddhist philosophy, as well as Western philosophy. While at McMaster, he had a chance meeting with the Dalai Lama and the 16th Karmapa, which again changed his life trajectory, although perhaps not quite as dramatically as the ice hockey changed. He moved on to the religion department at the University of Virginia, which at the time was the top program in the US for the study of Tibetan Buddhism, and then to Wittenberg University, amongst a list of others that he has worked at in the US. 20 years ago, 1995, Professor Powers joined the ANU here in Canberra. And in 2013, he was elected as a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, which is a very prestigious honour which is only accorded to a small number of leading academics across the country. He's also received an Excellence in Supervision Award from the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific, and a National Award from the Australian Teaching and Learning Centre for Outstanding Undergraduate Training. Very illustrious indeed. Please welcome for us Professor John Powers.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you to Forum Australia for inviting me here. This is, as you can imagine, a bit of a departure for me. It's a different sort of crowd from what I'm used to dealing with. I mostly deal with undergraduates at the ANU, and of course PhD students and so forth. A lot of us academics don't really spend that much time out in the community, so this is, when I do get these opportunities, I generally really enjoy doing it because it's often nice to talk to people with a different perspective than my undergraduates. Firstly, I need to sort of clarify a bit on what I'm doing. The program says that I'm going to be giving a comparative religions perspective, which I'm not really going to do. I'll talk a little bit about different religions, but what I'm mainly going to do is talk about Buddhism because that's what I actually know best, and that's where my expertise is. But it is worth mentioning, I think, a bit that different religions do have different ways of dealing with stress, as well as, sort of a range of existential problems. And each religion, one of the things that I stress in my courses is that every religion has a particular problematic that it identifies. That is, what it sees as the core existential problem. And then once it identifies that, it identifies a solution or a set of solutions to dealing with that problem. So in the case of Christianity, for instance, the core existential problem is original sin. And so we're born in sin, we're raised in iniquity, there's no way that we can do that, we can get out of this on our own. And so the solution is God's grace, as we need to find God's grace, and God's grace is what saves us. In Buddhism, you don't have that. That is, Buddhism doesn't believe in any sort of supreme being. Buddhism isn't really concerned about where everything came from. It's really concerned with the here and now. It tends to be very pragmatic, very practical in its orientation. Buddhism takes an empirical view of things. That is, it's primarily concerned with observation of the way things are, with analysis of the actual situation, and then with dealing what the problems are from that situation. So the core problematic in Buddhism is suffering. So according to Buddhism, and this is the first noble truth of the Four Noble Truths articulated by the Buddha, the truth is that all life involves suffering. As long as you're alive, you're going to suffer. Which sounds kind of pessimistic, and it could be to an extent, but if you think about it, it's actually quite an accurate description of the way things are. That is, what Buddhism points out is that everybody is going to get sick, everybody's going to get old, everybody's going to experience various sorts of pain, physical, emotional, and so forth. We're going to have to put up with things that we would prefer not to have to deal with. We're going to have things taken from us that we would prefer to keep. And this is going to be uncertain. We can't know what's going to happen in all of this. And so, things can be going along just fine, and all of a sudden everything changes. And this is another aspect of Buddhist philosophy, by the way, the idea of impermanence. That everything is impermanent. We don't know from one moment to the next what's going to happen. We don't know how many of us are going to make it out of this restaurant. It's not, and this is again not a pessimistic thing, it's rather lowering our expectations and being realistic about what we can expect, okay? So when Buddhism says that all life involves suffering, this is, what it's primarily concerned about is not the actual fact of suffering so much. This is something that's taken me a while to understand. It's more concerned with the emotional overlay that comes with that. The idea, for instance, that this shouldn't be happening to me. I'm a good person. This isn't fair. Stress and suffering and so forth should happen to other people, or at least it shouldn't happen to me. So the emotional additional overlay of suffering is the thing that Buddhism is particularly concerned about. That is addressing this idea and figuring out what to do with it. So the second noble truth of Buddhism then goes along with this. The second noble truth is that suffering is caused by desire. The reason why we suffer is because we have desires. And so the key then, of course, to reducing suffering is to reduce desire. And I have a great story. It may not work in this context, but it works really well with undergrads, so bear with me and see if it works. When I first started graduate school, I was in Canada at Vassar University, and my first teaching experience was tutoring a class of undergraduates, all 18 and 19-year-olds. And I started out with the first noble truth of Buddhism, that all life involves suffering. And they all looked at me like, this is really depressing, or, what do you mean suffering? They all had, their parents were paying for their university, they had cars, they had boyfriends, girlfriends, parties, they had people who picked up the rooms and cleaned after them, made food for them, and so forth. And, they looked at me like, dude, where's the suffering, And one student raised their hand and said, well, it doesn't have to be that way. And it was very frustrating, because this is my first time trying to teach this stuff, and, I had this sort of theory, but trying to explain it to a group of undergraduates, it was absolutely hopeless. And so it was a total failure. So the second year, though, this was cool. The second year, same class, but this was a night class. So these were all adults. These were their parents like 20 years down the road. After they had mortgage payments and car payments and dental payments and working late and stuff like that. And so I started out with, mindful of my first failure of trying to explain the Four Noble Truths. And I started out with, the first noble truth is that all life involves suffering. They all looked like, yeah, that's news. So now I tell the story about undergraduates every year, and I say, if it doesn't make sense to you now, give it a rest. Try it 10 years from now, and see if you're feeling suffering then. And then again, when I went with the second noble truth, that suffering is caused by desire, there was sort of nods of recognition. Yeah, I can see that. Because it's this emotional overlay, it's this additional factor that we bring to the suffering that makes it more suffering, that makes it more painful. So then the third noble truth is that suffering can be overcome. And the way to overcome suffering is by following the Eightfold Noble Path, which is the fourth of the truths. And the Eightfold Noble Path is basically concerned with cognitive reorientation. The problem for Buddhism, the reason why we suffer is cognitive, so the solution is also cognitive. And what this means is that the way you reduce suffering is by changing the way you think about things. And so the first part of the Noble Path is thinking about your views about things, your views about reality. Recognizing what views are accurate and which ones aren't, and then adjusting the ones that are inaccurate, and particularly the ones that lead to suffering, and changing those to ones that are conducive to positive states of mind. So, for instance, one of the things that comes out of this is Buddhist meditation, which is something that Buddhism is very famous for. And interestingly, Buddhist meditation has been found across the board in a lot of different contexts to be very good at helping people to reduce stress. And I find this interesting because it's not what it was designed to do, but it does it well for a lot of people. My wife was a psychologist until a few years ago, and she practiced a form of therapy called dialectical behavior therapy that started out primarily using the Socratic method, but came to incorporate elements of Buddhist mindfulness meditation, and has been found to be very successful in terms of dealing with a lot of stress-related issues, suicide prevention, and a range of other things. And so her job was primarily applying Buddhist meditation theory in practical context in a clinical setting. And so that was one of the things that sort of brought us together, was that we had, I had sort of the theoretical aspect of this, and she had the more practical aspect, applying Buddhist meditation practice to a sort of practical clinical situation. And again, one of the things that I found interesting about this was that this wasn't what it was designed to do. It wasn't really designed to reduce stress. From a Buddhist perspective, reducing stress is actually a very easy thing to do. This is really minimal, first grade sort of stuff. What Buddhism is really concerned about is eliminating suffering entirely. And it claims, and this is where Buddhism becomes very optimistic, I think, it claims that it is possible to change your thinking to such an extent that you no longer have stress, that you no longer have the sources of unhappiness. And so you can completely eliminate these causes of suffering by doing particular sorts of practices. And one of the most important ones is the practice of mindfulness. This is where you begin. And this, by the way, is something, this can be your homework if you want, okay? So when you go home tonight, if you're interested in trying this out, a very good basic exercise of Buddhist meditation theory is to find yourself a quiet place, preferably fairly dark, not with a lot of lights, and quiet. Sit with your spine straight, And your mouth should be shut, the tongue on the roof of the mouth. It's very important to keep the neck basically straight. And just focus on the in-breath and out-breath. It's a very, very calming exercise. And the more you do it, you'll find the more you will tend to, most people find that it tends to reduce their stress. And it's something you can, this is one thing you can do on your own. A lot of meditation requires a teacher, requires ongoing training. But breath meditation is something that basically anybody can do. And I find that when I do this with my students, I do this often at the beginning of the class, students will report that they feel a lot calmer, like all of a sudden, usually the first time is kind of revelation. So the first time you do this, the calm and the peacefulness you feel is often revelatory. And I often have students report this, that just a very, like 5 minutes or so of following the breath in and out, and particularly being aware of just a touch on the inside of the nostrils, and trying to focus on that. And when your mind goes away, bring your attention back to that. That is something that can dramatically reduce stress, just even doing it 5 or 10 minutes a day. And just on a personal level, this was something that for me was kind of revelatory. It was kind of surprising. Because as an academic, you tend to teach these things theoretically. And so finding out that they actually work was quite a, it was a bit surprising actually. How much time do I have? Okay. All right, 5, okay. So now I'm going to get personal. This was one of the things. One of the applications of this for me was about 4 years ago now. My mother was diagnosed with ALS, which is a degenerative neuromuscular disease, and it's always fatal. And so once it happened, it was clear that she was given 6 months to live initially. And so I took a leave of absence from my job. My wife and I moved to the U.S. To take care of her, and we spent most of the rest of the year doing this. And I have no training in this, okay? I was an undergraduate studying philosophy. I went to graduate school and studied Indian philosophy in Canada. Then I went to the University of Virginia and I studied Buddhist philosophy. So I have absolutely no background for this sort of thing. So it was quite a change, to try to deal with like bedpans and all of the sort of nitty-gritty of respite care. I never really imagined myself doing this, but there I was, and it was a 24-hour-a-day thing. And my wife and I split the day, so I had the day shift, she had the night shift. And I had to learn to cope with this. And a lot of it was really difficult. Just the physical aspects of dealing with an invalid. Getting somebody out of bed, getting them to the bathroom, bowel movements, things like that. All this stuff, became sort of, what I was doing on an ongoing basis day to day. And a lot of it was very difficult. Trying to think about how I was going to do this. And, again, just the physical dimensions of it. And I found that, first of all, the sadness of it all was difficult. And then I was thinking about Buddhist ideas of impermanence. That is that one of the most important meditations you do in Buddhism is meditation on death. Being aware of the fact that we're all dying. Not thinking, oh, this is a big surprise, it's not going to happen to me or whatever. And again, it's not a morbid sort of thing. What you find when you meet Buddhists who do this sort of meditation, death meditation, they tend to be the happiest people you'll meet. And one of the things that I think that comes with this is that as you take a sort of, unjaundiced look at the way the world is, you come to expect less and less from it. And so the more you lower your expectations, the more you're able to actually experience joy. And I find this a lot with people, a lot of, say, the Tibetan Lamas in particular that I've met. I've spent a lot of time traveling with them, eating with them, living with them, and so forth. And they tend to be extremely happy people because they expect so little. So when good things happen, they can really enjoy them because they're not expecting, they have a very sort of even-handed idea about what the world is and what to expect from it. So they can be very happy because they're not expecting the world to be better than it's going to be. So this was very helpful for me, actually, sort of reducing my expectations, being aware of impermanence, being aware of the reality that everybody is dying, and being involved in this process with somebody who was dying, and also sort of relating that to my own life was very, very, it was a very revelatory sort of experience. Becoming more aware of my own impermanence, my own mortality, and being involved in the process of doing this with my mother. And also, talking about this with her. And it really helped her also to cope with the fact of her, imminent demise. And we sort of all worked through this together. We all talked about it together. And it turned out to be a very good bonding experience. The whole family came together. I had a sister and a sister-in-law and other people who came and got involved in this process. So it was a real team effort, and we were all involved in it. And I think the process itself was actually very good for all of us. It was, it turned out to be much more positive than you would have expected. And it wasn't really at all morbid as we were doing it. The other thing, and this is just the last thing that I'll mention, is that Buddhism has an idea of emptiness, which sounds very negative in English, but it really isn't in Buddhism. I think that a term that's often used to translate this is more like openness. The idea is that we tend to see things in terms of real essence. That is, we see people as having a real essence, having a soul or a self. And Buddhism denies this, which sounds like a negation, sounds like something negative, but according to Buddhism, this is actually a liberating sort of thing, because it's a false notion. It's something that we grasp onto, and it's the cause of all of our major problems. Now, once you get rid of this, you can be a lot happier, and you can be a lot more open to the future, and you can be and it makes it possible to change too. And I found that this in particular for me was probably the most valuable sort of practice that I was able to do. Because a lot of the stuff, again, particularly the physical stuff, was really, really difficult. But when I analyzed it in terms of this idea of emptiness, that is, that there is no inherent existence to things like bodily fluids, or dealing with bodies, or dealing with illness and things like that, there's nothing inherent in it. It's all a matter of how you perceive it. And there were health professionals, like nurse practitioners and nurses and so forth, who came in and they did this all the time, and I realized, they can do it, I can do it too, there's nothing special about them. It's a question of how you orient yourself cognitively, and sort of, working with them and thinking about this idea of emptiness made it much more possible for me to do this. And so as time went along, things that had initially been extremely stressful, really difficult to do, things that I had no training for, became just sort of routine, and things that had led to a lot of stress in the past, like getting up in the middle of the night, dealing with bodily functions and things that, after a while, you just learn to deal with it. So, and this was, this is the thing I'm going to conclude with, is that it was a surprise to me because I had always basically dealt with Buddhism in a theoretical sense, in a classroom situation, dealing with theories, having students read texts and so forth. And so actually putting it into practice in a way that I had never expected to do turned out to be a very interesting experience. It gave me a whole new perspective on what Buddhism is and why people, within Buddhist communities do this sort of practice and how they get the sort of results that they claim to have. So I think that's probably about out of time now, but I guess we're going to have a time for questions at the end. So if anybody has any questions and you want me to talk in more detail, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Professor Powers. That was very useful. There was some stuff in there that I must admit gave me cause for optimism and pessimism, I have to say. The first is all the stuff about mindfulness and the technique required. I don't know how many of you have tried meditating mindfulness. I've given it a go over the last several months, trying to help me deal with stress and just try and be a better person. I struggle. I can't count to 10 breaths without losing track. I fall asleep a lot. I don't know if anyone else finds that. My posture is terrible at the best of times, and if I try and sit up straight on a bed or a couch to do this, I think that basically knocks me out of contention of being able to do it. I'll keep working at it, I promise, but it makes it sound very, very difficult. But I'm also very happy because there's a cause for optimism amongst there as well, not least in terms of Professor Powers getting through to our young people, to his undergraduates, to young people here, elsewhere in Canberra. If some of the pillars of Buddhism and mindfulness are impermanence and emptiness, I think you've got a pretty natural head start when it comes to talking to young people. I think the rate that young people sort of churn through their iPads and iPods and latest devices, I think they have a pretty good handle on the idea of impermanence, and I think if you talk to them for more than several minutes, that you're often quite struck by their great grasp of emptiness. So I have some optimism as well. So thank you for leaving me with that. Our next